What I'd like to do today is to provide a very broad overview of marine invasions from a North American perspective and try to use that to begin a discussion about invasions in this part of the world, which I'm only just learning about, and I look forward to learning a great deal more during the next couple of days. By way of background, I'm from the Smithsonian Institution, and I think most people think of the institution as a series of museums on the Mall in Washington, D.C., which is certainly true, but we have many other campuses, including a number of marine research sites distributed along the east coast of the U.S. There are essentially 4 laboratories from Chesapeake Bay, Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where I'm located, Florida, Belize, and Panama. And just this is intended by way of introduction. The Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, or SERC, is located on Chesapeake Bay, which is my home base. It's about 25 kilometers east of Washington, D.C., on the nation's largest estuary. And while that's home base for me, we actually have established a research program with labs on the West Coast, in California, and in Oregon. And from those home sites, we do research throughout North America with a primary goal of trying to understand invasions in marine ecosystems on a continental scale. What I'd like to do today, in the time that I have, is to review invasions in North America. This is a roadmap of where I expect to go in the next 20 minutes or so. I'd like to provide a background of what we know about the extent of invasions in coastal marine ecosystems and the drivers for those invasions in North America. From there, I want to focus in more closely on looking at invasions from a latitudinal perspective, particularly examining the west coast of North America. And I want to explore some of the possible mechanisms for the patterns that we observe. And with that background, then, I'd like to begin to explore and think a little bit about invasions in this part of the world. And as I said, I'm not an expert. I know very little about invasions in this part of the world, but I look forward to learning more and thinking about comparisons with areas that I do know better. Over the last 15 years, we've been collecting records of non-native species in coastal systems in North America and essentially creating a database, an information system that we call NEMESIS, the National Exotic Marine and Estuarine Species Information System. Essentially, we're gleaning as much information as we can about invasions from the literature, continually scanning new records of species in marine systems, monitoring programs that we're conducting, surveys of existing museum records, as well as standing up reporting systems where people can send information to us that we then try to validate and verify. From that, we're essentially creating a database and using that to examine various patterns of invasion. Ultimately, we'd like to use those for predictions and management, as well as detection, and as I'll talk about briefly, evaluating the efficacy of management strategies to limit or reduce new invasions. While NEMESIS is really a research tool for us, it's how we collect information to analyze the patterns that we see. We also are serving those data online. We're developing a portal for other people to access that information, public, researchers, management, policy, and so forth. And this is just a topical outline of some of the areas that we collect information and present information. Right now we have online information for tunicates and decapod crustaceans. We're slowly rolling out each taxonomic group as we move through it and sort of vet and clean up the information there for public consumption. What I'd like to do now is to give you a few looks at the data that we accumulate from NEMESIS. This shows taxonomic distribution of non-native species in coastal marine ecosystems for North America. Essentially, we have records of about 400 non-native species that we consider to be established in our coastal marine systems. Those are distributed accordingly by these different taxonomic groups, with most of them falling in the crustacea and mollusks, and fewer as you go up the ladder here. And not surprisingly, it's the species that are bigger and more conspicuous that we know much more about. That doesn't mean that there are fewer invasions in some of those other groups. It's probably the edge of our knowledge, and many of those groups are very, very poorly understood. And so what I want to emphasize is that these are the patterns that we see of what's been reported. This is what we know. It's sort of a minimum estimate of the number of non-native species in each of these groups. And there's still a lot of work to be done in exploring many of the groups, particularly the smaller taxonomic groups. This is another slice through Nemesis and the analysis that we do looking at the time of introduction or the time of first record and the life history of the organism and what we know about trade, mechanisms of human-mediated introduction associated with those records, from which we make inferences about the vector or the transfer mechanism responsible for bringing those species to our marine ecosystems. And the main picture that derives from this, looking cumulatively, is that shipping is a dominant signal for the invasions that we know of in North American marine ecosystems. And the next largest single mechanism vector is fisheries, the movement of aquaculture, oysters, mainly shellfish and things that are associated with those that are transferred and become established. And this other signal that you see here is titled multiple. And what that means is that those are species for which there are multiple transfer mechanisms possible. And the color-coded part, the white portion of that bar, indicates the proportion that for which ships are possible. So the main picture that I want you to get from this is that ships have been a dominant signal historically over time, but there's also a fair number of species for which it's not clear that it's ships or it's something else. And this is perhaps illustrated by the Chinese mitten crab, which is established on the west coast and on the east coast of North America. This could have come in the ballast tank of a ship as larvae that were released and colonized, or it could have come in as live trade. It's probably the most commonly eaten crab in the world, and it's moved around in that respect. This is another sort of closer look at the shipping component of that signal. So what you saw in the other figure was about 170 or so species that are attributed solely to ships. But then within ships, there are multiple mechanisms possible. Organisms could have been on the bottom, the hull of a ship, underwater surfaces, or they could have been in ballast water that's taken into ballast tanks, in training organisms, larvae, a wide diversity of organisms that are moved with a ship and released in another port of call. And basically the message that we see historically is that of those species attributed to ships, fouling has been important, ballast has been important. So both are important, but there's some uncertainty. The black are those species that are attributed solely to fouling or solely to ballast water. The gray zone are species that could have come in either compartment, mainly because many species on the hull of a ship also have planktonic larvae that can be taken up in the ballast tank of a ship. So both are important, but there's a fair amount of uncertainty about the relative strength of each of those from a North American perspective. Looking again at Nemesis from a continental scale to a coastal scale, what you see are rather large differences in the number of non-native species that are known to be established by coast, with many more on the Pacific coast or the west coast of North America compared to the east coast and fewest on the Gulf Coast. The color coding there is just the proportion that are crustaceans, the largest group. But the main point I want you to see is that there's quite a lot of regional variation. And if we look at that over time, what you see play out is, this slide shows the number of new invasions that are considered established for each 30-year interval beginning in 1790 up until the year 2000. And this is the number of new non-native species reported to be established. So from that last slide, you would expect many more on the west coast, but the rate of increase, detected rate of increase is much greater than the East Coast and then fewest on the Gulf Coast. So over time, we see this increasing rate of newly detected invasions. There's some uncertainty about what the actual rate of invasions is, because these are records that are gleaned from the literature, from surveys, sort of bycatch if you want. And so it gives us information about what's been detected. There's fairly strong consensus that there's an increased rate of invasions, but what the actual shape function is, I think, is still a bit uncertain. No doubt it's increasing over time, but how fast and what the exact rate is a bit uncertain at the present. That pattern that I showed you in the last slide is driven, not surprisingly, primarily by ships. And that shouldn't be surprising because I told you that ships were an important vector, but the role of ships has increased dramatically over time. It's the source of trade, global trade. It's where most of our goods, how most of our goods get moved around the world, and it's ever increasing in terms of number of vessels, size of vessels, speed of vessels, all of which relate to increased propagule supply or transport opportunity. Because we're interested in invasions and understanding the drivers and ultimately managing invasions, reducing risk, we've spent a fair amount of time looking at ships and understanding how ships behave, or the behavioral ecology of ships, if you want, from a perspective of transfer opportunity. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. Congress established a law. Under that law, ships were required to report to the U.S. Coast Guard and to our lab on arrival how much ballast they had, where it came from, how much was going to be discharged, and whether it was managed, treated in any way to reduce the risk of transferring species. Coast Guard has regulatory authority. Our lab, essentially the role we play is to analyze the information that's coming in, look at the behavioral ecology of ships, and try to think deep thoughts about what that means from an invasion perspective. Just to give you a sense of the scale of shipping in the U.S., we get about 100,000 vessel arrivals per year to ports around the country. And those are roughly evenly divided from ships that come from overseas and ships that are moving internally from one U.S. port to another U.S. port. If we think about that from a biological perspective, ships being the conveyor belt, and think about the potential biology involved, for overseas vessels alone, we estimate about 100 million metric tons of ballast is discharged in U.S. waters. From the underwater hull surface area, we estimate about 335 million square meters of underwater surface area is in flux coming into ports from those overseas arrivals. So fairly big numbers, big opportunity for species transfer. I'm going to show you some of the information and way we think about the data that we get from a shipping perspective. This shows the number of overseas arrivals distributed across major ports in the country, and the color coding simply denotes the relative abundance, with red being the largest and purple being the smallest. So not surprisingly, as you look at finer and finer geographic scales, you see a fair amount of variation. Some big ports, hot spots, others smaller ports with relatively little traffic and potentially fewer species transfer opportunity. One thing that's interesting, though, is if you think about the ballast component of that equation, is that not all ships are created equal. Some ships carry a lot of ballast, as many of you know, others not so much. So if you think about a big bulk carrier, it carries cargo in one direction, and the other direction, to compensate for a lack of cargo, it will carry water, ballast water. The same with an oil tanker, one directional flow, as opposed to a container ship that's always in cargo, and so often carries relatively little water. Same with a cruise ship. So what you see here essentially is that some ports that have high traffic, like the tip of Florida around Miami, have relatively low ballast volume. And that's because those are dominated by cruise ships and container ships. Other ports are a pretty good match, such as this part of Texas that has to do with oil tankers. LA Long Beach, not so much, mostly container ships. That translates into relatively little ballast volume. So we're gaining a fairly fine perspective on what the ballast water compartment and the hull surface area compartment looks like in terms of flux and connectivity with the rest of the world. And we also are able to look at that connectivity in terms of the flux of water. And the next few slides are going to essentially show you that not only are not all ships created equal, but not all ports are created equal in terms of not just the arrival of ships, but where they come from. This shows the sources of overseas ballast discharged onto the East Coast. And not surprising, for the East Coast, major trading partner is Europe, Northern Europe, with a fair amount in Central, Northern South America. Quite different, of course, from the Gulf of Mexico. Actually, a lot of the traffic is from within the Gulf of Mexico from a ballast volume perspective, red connoting the largest proportion. And then, of course, on the West Coast, most of the trade is Pacific Rim, with most of the ballast deriving from Asia. So we have a fairly good perspective on what the vessel flux is like. We don't have a lot of information on what the biota is associated with that flux. We know there's biology involved, that a lot of organisms are being moved, but each vessel is often quite different because it comes from a different source, port, a different time, different duration of voyage. But we're able to think about broadly how ballast management is changing over time. What this shows is sort of a snapshot in 2007, 2008, I believe, of ballast management from two different perspectives. One is transoceanic traffic, vessels coming to the U.S. across oceans. The other is traffic that's coming Pan-American, so it doesn't really cross an ocean but moves latitudinally. And as you probably know, ships are required to treat their ballast in the U.S. before they discharge from coming from overseas. And what that means right now is they're required to undertake open ocean ballast exchange, essentially flushing their ships out at sea to reduce the concentration of coastal organisms, whereby the oceanic organisms are thought not to pose as much risk because it's a habitat mismatch. So ships are required to do this if it's safe to do so. And the requirement is that they flush their tanks out in an open ocean over 200 miles from shore. So transoceanic traffic is able to do that fairly well. The blue indicates exchange points, the ends of exchange points that are 200 miles from shore. Purple is within that 200 mile from shore destination. So about 91% of the vessel traffic coming from overseas to the US undertake open ocean exchange, whereas a very small fraction, only 24%, do for the vessels coming in this direction. That's primarily because they don't ever spend time 200 miles at sea, 200 miles offshore. So the opportunity to do that is very limited. So what we see is that over the last 10 years, we've had this transition of ships arriving with untreated ballast to ships that are treating ballast in a various way depending on what the geographic origin is. And what we expect to see, of course, over the next 10 years is a transition to treatment technology, which will serve to further reduce the concentration of coastal organisms to a discharge standard, which not only would reduce the concentration of organisms in these vessels, but also these vessels and allow many of them to actually treat their ballast, whereas they don't today. I want to transition now to look more at this question of latitude, the latitudinal pattern of invasions that we see in North America, and particularly for the West Coast. What this shows is the number of non-native species of invertebrates and algae at different bays from Southern California, San Diego, up into Alaska. 12 different bays. These are the data that come from Nemesis, the number of non-native species, invertebrates and algae that we consider to be established. 3 points to see. One, San Francisco Bay is an outlier. big winner or loser, depending on how you look at it. And Alaska also is really quite different. Relatively few non-native species established in Alaska. Over the past 10 years, we've spent a fair amount of time thinking about this and pursuing research to test three general ideas, hypotheses about what explains this pattern in very broad terms. One possibility is that there are very strong biases in the data. Simply put, there are a lot more people in California studying invasions. They've been studying them for a much longer time than in Alaska. So the quality of information is much higher. The quantity of information is much higher. More people looking, search effort is higher. Another possibility is that there are very strong differences in the susceptibility to invasions. That is, if you inoculate different bays at the same level, you'll see a different response depending on where you are because of environment or because of biological interactions, resistance to invasion. The third possibility, of course, is that there are really strong differences in propagule supply. Different amounts of activity yield different numbers of organisms that are transferred by humans, result in different levels of invasion. So these are three general hypotheses that we've been pursuing research to examine more closely. What I want to do is step through each of them very quickly with respect to this latitudinal pattern that we see on the West Coast. And to examine the issue of bias, we've focused a great deal of attention on hard substrate communities, sessile invertebrate communities. The reason for that is that if you look at Nemesis again, what you see is a number of non-native species associated with hard substrate, or different habitats rather, in North America. A dominant signal for hard substrate. Black are those that are sessile or sedentary, those that are mobile invertebrates and algae are gray. A very strong signal for hard substrate, a fair number of species that are on hard substrate and soft substrate, and then some species that are in the plankton and hard substrate, depending on what life stage you consider. Main point is that hard substrate is a dominant habitat for many of the non-native species that have established in North America. So we focused a fair amount of attention to use this system to understand better the latitudinal pattern of invasion that we see. We've been conducting surveys at different estuaries throughout North America for the last 10 years. The goal has been to do standardized surveys that remove bias, so we can go out and sample the same way at many different locations and ask, do we see latitudinal differences, continental scale differences, or not? And today, of course, I want to focus primarily on those same estuaries that I showed you in the previous figure, from San Diego all the way out to the Aleutian Islands to Dutch Harbor. 12 different sites that were surveyed in a standardized way, whereby we put out PVC settling plates as hard substrate for 3 months, let the invertebrates colonize, bring them in and analyze who's there. Sort of process them through a stepwise fashion. We're the proud owners of about 150,000 voucher vials that we've been chugging through to identify who the species are. This just shows you some pictures of what those settling plates look like after about a 3-month exposure. On average, we probably see about 30 to 40 sessile invertebrate species on one of those panels, and then, of course, a similar number of mobile biota. I'm only going to focus on the sessile invertebrates. Short story, 10 years later, this is the pattern that we see. If you look at the number of non-native species on those panels by bay, going from Southern California to Alaska, total number of non-native species, a very strong, significant decline as you go across latitude. Of course, that's driven in large part by Alaska as an outlier, which is similar to what I showed you previously from the literature. But even if you remove Alaska, you see a very strong latitudinal pattern. Interestingly, this shows similarity to a study that was published by Dove Sachs, looking at non-native species richness for birds and for mammals as you go from about Southern California up to 70 degrees latitude, remarkably similar to what we see. In that paper, he focused primarily on this disconnect as you go into the subtropics and tropics of a big decline in non-native species richness. For the marine realm, we don't know. We don't know if this occurs in North America or not. That's a direction that we're trying to pursue now. I'd like to shift very quickly to consider this issue of differences in susceptibility. We've focused mainly on looking at environmental resistance, and for using San Francisco as a model, asking whether those species that are in California could colonize further north, whether there's any barrier to colonization. Essentially, we've used environmental niche models for a number of species now, and this is a paper that was published by Kat de Rivera looking at Litorhinus saxatilis, barnacle Amphibalanus improvisus, tunicate styloclava, and the green crab, your crab, Carcinus manus. And the question essentially is, if you look at where in the world one of these species is, like the Litorhinus saxatilis, using the environmental characteristics of those distributions, draw an envelope around that and project it to other parts of the world and ask, could it live here? And on the west coast of North America, I point out that Litorhinus saxatilis is only known from San Francisco Bay. If you look at what the models suggest, the red is those areas that are thought to be within its environmental tolerance. What this suggests is that the opportunity for northward expansion for Litorhinus saxatilis is not limited by environment. Certainly demographic differences across environments might matter, but what the model says is that Alaska should be colonized, is within the realm of possibility to colonize for Litorhinus saxatilis. That's true for all of the other 3 species. We've done similar models for another 10 species in California that suggest the same. Main point is it doesn't appear that environment prevents colonization into Alaska, that there's not evidence for an environmental barrier. We don't have similar information for this issue about biotic resistance as to whether biological interactions might limit northward expansion. At the present time, though, it doesn't appear that there's a limitation or resistance to invasion toward the north. The third question that we're interested in, of course, is propagule supply. And we don't have very good data on the number of individual organisms or the number of species that have been delivered over time to different bays along the west coast. What we do know, though, is that the vessel traffic magnitude is remarkably different. And if you look at Panama, very, very high levels because of the Panama Canal. From Panama going north, you see, again, a very strong latitudinal climb. And if you look at Alaska, it's really just a relatively small blip compared to the other sites. And I want to point out that blip, even that small blip, is a relatively recent phenomenon in Alaska. A lot of that began with the opening up of oil in the 1970s and fishery and population increase around that time. So even though Alaska shows up on that figure, it's actually overestimating what the historical contribution is. We don't have good information about the propagules associated with that, but there's fairly good evidence or support that propagule supply likely plays a role, where the data are consistent with that at the present time. So the picture that emerges for the West Coast is that if this shows number of non-native species established in California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. Most in California, as you've been seeing throughout this talk, and decreasing as you move northward. The black shows the number of non-native species that were first recognized or recorded in California. The main point is that it appears that California is the point of introduction and that species are spreading northward over time. Our environmental niche models suggest that many of those species in California should continue a northward expansion given the opportunity to spread primarily by human interaction. But I don't want you to leave thinking that it's only commercial ships that are driving this dynamic. So California, and particularly San Francisco Bay, is a hotspot for invasions, and then they spread. And that spread certainly could happen by commercial vessel traffic, but we actually think that recreation and fishing vessels are a pretty important component to that, sort of like bees around a hive that are visiting lots of different areas. What this shows is data unpublished from Chela Zabin that looked at 2 years of traffic, I think 2006 to 2008, of vessels arriving to marinas, so recreational boats in Monterey, Half Moon Bay on the outer coast, and Bodega Harbor to the north. And what this shows is the number of vessels that that came from or went to San Francisco Bay from those outer coasts over a 2-year period. Main point is that there's a lot of connectivity that happens. In California, for San Francisco, the estimate is about 150,000 recreational vessels. For California as a whole, about 1 million recreational vessels. So the opportunity for secondary spread is really quite great by these vessels. We don't have a very good sense of what the biology is associated with those at this point. We're doing some surveys. Certainly some vessels are really quite laden with non-native species as well as native species. So the opportunity is there. To try to pull this together, then I think what we're interested in is really looking at the vector biology and aspects of vector management, the interaction between propagule supply and invasion or vector strength, the number of non-native species arriving, and then this management component whereby we're looking at implementing what the effect of implementing a certain management strategy is in the case of ballast exchange. How effective is that at reducing future invasions? So we're really quite interested in this feedback loop between the vector, the invasion, and the management. And so a lot of the components that I've talked about, we're trying to integrate into this more holistic approach to better understand the dynamic or the interplay between those different components. And I think a real key question for us and a challenge for us in invasion ecology is, well, I think we all understand that the more things that are transported, the more often they're transported, the greater the risk is, like the probability of invasions. What we really don't know, though, is what that shape function looks like between propagule supply and invasion probability. Generally, as you increase, the opportunity should increase to some saturation point. But it's likely to be quite different among different groups, taxonomic groups, among different locations, among different environments. And so that's the challenge for us, particularly if we want to think about this from a management and policy point of view. As many of you know, in the ballast management realm, the real question is how low do you go? What's the magic number in terms of the number of organisms that you should manage to? We don't know the answer except lower is better. So more broadly, I think what we're interested in our research group is to understand how invasion dynamics are going to change in time. What's the efficacy of management, and how does that translate into invasion patterns as we move forward and those management strategies are implemented? What's the effect of shift in trade patterns? So the Panama Canal is undergoing an expansion which will propagate across the globe in terms of how many vessels go where, how big the vessels are. We should expect a major shift in trade that has consequences from an invasion dynamic perspective. We don't know what that is at this point. And then finally, of course, how does climate change alter the dynamic in terms of opportunity for colonization, in terms of the demographics, in terms of interactions with species? These are big open questions. But these are directions that we're trying to use the data we have to explore for North America. With that sort of broad background, what I'd like to do is take about 2 minutes to think about this region and how that perspective projects into this region. What this shows are some data that Joao has put together, working on a manuscript and analysis of invasions in this region, for which he's identified a little over 50 non-native species that are considered to be established in Macaronesia across these different taxonomic groups. And you'll see that the distribution is a bit different than what I showed you for North America, with crustaceans and mollusks leading in North America. Not so much here. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means that it's different or the amount of information that's been collected is different. This is an open question that would be interesting to explore. If we look across islands, these are the number of non-native species considered to be established for invertebrates and algae in the marine systems across the islands. Most in Azores. One thing that's interesting in looking at the records is that 80%, more than 80% of those species have been reported since 1970, so rather recent. What happened historically? I don't know. I'd be interested to know what the resolution is. How much do people know? Or is it just artifact of more recent interest in looking at invasions in this area? And I think moving forward, an interesting thing that would be interesting to discuss in this venue is the invasions dynamics broadly. What are the pieces of the puzzle, and sort of what's the interaction strength across those? So within the region, what are the number of non-native species? But from a vector perspective and opportunity, what's the connectivity to different sources from which non-native species might come? There's certainly a lot of trade that's going on between Europe and the Mediterranean. Some, certainly vessel traffic as one vector. Vessel traffic moving between this region, but a fair amount of linkage in this direction, and perhaps with opportunity for secondary spread into the Azores and other islands, and certainly the same with Asia. So what does the connectivity look like in terms of number of ships, number of shipments of live organisms? What's the magnitude of the biotic transfer? How many species? How many individuals? And then, of course, a big question, what's the susceptibility to invasions? So even if we know that these species are moving around, what's the likelihood that they can colonize? And what's the likelihood further downstream that they would actually have a significant impact? And so I think these are big open questions that I'm hoping to learn from you all more about how that plays out in this region, and think about whether there are areas for management that would make sense at the present time. So I've gone on too long, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.